everyone and welcome to my channel, and welcome in particular to this edition of Crash Course in the Classics. For those who are new here, my name is Nikki. I'm an author and editor, and I post videos here on YouTube about writing, editing, reading and all the things I love. In this particular series I'm doing breakdowns of some of the big names in classic literature, and in these videos I just like to give you a little history about them, a bit of a breakdown of some of their works, key to the themes, and some of my recommendations in terms of how to approach these authors and their writing. Today we are doing Jane Austen. We've done a couple of the men, so I thought it was time to do a woman. So we've got our collection here of the 6 main Austen works, plus this lovely little volume of some of the shorter pieces. So to start off with, let's have a look at Jane herself. She is born in Hampshire, and she is the second daughter in a reasonably large family of a rector. She's born in December 1775. Her father encouraged a love of learning in all the children, including the girls, and she really lived within a world that involved around clergy life, country clergymen and minor landed gentry, and you notice that most of her novels are set within those environments and those using those kinds of people as her characters. She spent her life alone, essentially, romantically at least. She did receive a marriage proposal in 1802, which she accepted only to then change her mind the next day. However, she had an incredibly close relationship with her elder sister, Cassandra. She began some of her early writing around 1787 into the early 1790s. She tried a lot of different forms at this point, but she did a great deal of parody as well. She began Sense and Sensibility in 1795, roughly. And initially this was in epistolary form. Epistolary novels were the big thing of the 18th century. Thinking of books like Clarissa, Dangerous Liaisons. That was a big format. However, it was moving out of fashion at that point, so at some point between starting it and finishing the work she did change to the more standard novel style we're used to today. Her first draft of Pride and Prejudice was completed in 1797, and it was just after this, around the 1801 time, that her stable family life altered because her parents decided to retire to Bath. So they left their family home in Hampshire. And this involved Jane spending several years in which she moved around a lot. She spent a lot of time paying visits to people and staying in temporary lodgings, essentially. In 1809 she moves to Chawton with her mother and sister. And it's at this point that her writing really takes off. She settles down a bit more again. Sense and Sensibility is published in 1811, which is followed by Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park and Emma. Unfortunately, she becomes ill around 1816 and eventually dies in the middle of 1817. And she leaves behind 2 novels, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey, both of which are published in late 1817 posthumously, at which point she is also revealed as the author, because up until then she had been publishing these works anonymously and no one knew she was a woman. So let's now break down and have a little bit of a look at her works, the themes, and how you can approach them. So, as we can see here, these are the 6 main Jane Austen novels. Sense and Sensibility, Pride and Prejudice, Mansfield Park, Emma, Persuasion and Northanger Abbey. I also have here a little lovely edition which includes Sanditon, Lady Susan, some of the short works and a lot of her juvenile writing that's still in existence as well. Essentially, Jane Austen's works were what we would call novels of manners. They sort of fall at the start of the realist tradition, so we've moved away from epistolary novels and we're moving into this idea of presenting the world in a really realistic way, whereas in the past there was a habit to sort of caricature characters a little bit in around the middle of the 18th century into the later 18th century, and that was just starting to fade out, and we're coming into a period when they're looking more for realism, and that's particularly true as we move through into the early to mid 19th century. Satire and parody are very important to Jane Austen as well. Her novels are very comedic, and I think people tend to forget that, particularly with some of the TV type adaptations where they do tend to be taken fairly seriously. But I mean, Emma in particular is an especially funny, very witty novel, whereas Mansfield Park's probably the most serious of the 6 major works. Northanger Abbey here is an absolute parody. That's parodying the popular Gothic literature of the 18th century. It's actually one of my favourite Jane Austen works. It gets a bit of stick sometimes, but I actually really love it. I think it's such a clever piece, and it does work brilliantly as a parody. Most of her works revolve around the idea of tensions, either between the characters themselves, because of their different status, their different roles, or with the characters and society and what society expects of them. There's a concentration on personality. The characters' personalities are hugely important in all her works, and that's where a lot of the comedy and a lot of the wit comes from. And it is a wit that is blended, as I said, with hyperrealism. I mean, you can imagine these people really living, even though sometimes they are sort of presented in that highly comedic. It's not a caricature, but it's almost like a slightly exaggerated fashion. If you think of someone like Mr. Collins, for example, in Pride and Prejudice, he's such a bumbling oaf, and I think that's where you get a lot of the really comic, what's the word I'm looking for, tension between the other characters and him. And he doesn't mean to be bad, he doesn't mean to cause trouble, but he can't help it. It's just who he is. And that blends into the realism as well, because I think most of us in life, even if we're trying to do things right, sometimes we just rub people up the wrong way, we just don't get on with certain people. And I think that's where Jane Austen's novels excel, because they really show that within a society framework and within a much more condensed drawing room kind of scene. I mean, Jane Austen, of all the classic authors, is probably one of the most approachable. Her novels are fairly short. I mean, Mansfield Park's here is the longest. It's not huge. It's not like reading Tolstoy. I think with the comedy, they're fairly light-hearted. They have serious moments, but essentially they're very light, easy reads. Yes, they are written in some ways in the style of prose that is not as familiar to us today, but they're not as heavy as some of the big Russians, or even some of the French, like Victor Hugo or Dickens, come to that. So they are very accessible. If you haven't read any, I'm tempted to say start with Pride and Prejudice, because I think nearly everyone's seen a film or TV version as well, so you've got a sort of bit of familiarity there. Or Northanger Abbey. Perhaps if you do know Gothic literature, that might be a good one to move on to as well. I'd probably leave Mansfield Park Persuasion as some of the last ones. Do some of the comic ones or the really obviously accessible and familiar ones first. And then once you've read those, you might want to check out some of the younger works and the little unfinished pieces. In terms of versions, if you're someone who does like to watch a film or something before you read the book to get an idea of the story, then there are so many versions of these around. I think every one of them except for Northanger Abbey has had a theatrical adaptation, either a stage play, a musical, an opera, or sometimes all three, or at least two of them. They're very popular works for adaptation. But leaving the theatre aside and coming to film and television, Sense and Sensibility. There's the 1995 film with Emma Thompson and Kate Winslet. It has its faults, but essentially I think it's a quite pleasant, watchable version. There was also a 2008 BBC miniseries that is also worth looking at. With Sense and Sensibility and Pride and Prejudice, once you've read the originals, you may also want to check out the spoof versions that have been doing the rounds. So there's Pride and Prejudice and Zombies, which also has a film version, and then there's the book of Sense and Sensibility and Sea Monsters. Moving on to Pride and Prejudice now. Obviously Pride and Prejudice and Zombies film came out in 2016. I wouldn't watch that first if you've never seen an original version of Pride and Prejudice or read the book, but for later on it is a good laugh. The one I would recommend is the 1995 BBC version with Colin Firth. I don't think anyone's ever beaten that version. It is absolutely sublime. And I mean, I really didn't like the Keira Knightley film version of more recent years. That just really grated on me. But I think the trouble is, once you have this image of those characters played by Colin Firth, etc., from that 95 version, it's very hard to accept anyone else. In terms of Mansfield Park, there was a 2007 TV version, which I thought was pretty good. In all the cases, there were very old BBC versions as well, but I don't know how easy they are to get hold of now. And they probably do look a little bit dated. So I tend to be recommending the slightly more recent ones because I think it'll be easier for you to get hold of them. Emma, there is the 1996 film, which is okay. And there's a 2009 TV version, which is probably worth a look. Persuasion, again, around 2007 they redid a whole batch of these books as TV adaptations, and they were all pretty reasonable adaptations. So for Persuasion, I do like that 2007 version as well. And the same with Northanger Abbey, which had J.J. Field as Henry Tilney. Henry Tilney is one of my favourite Jane Austen heroes after the obvious Darcy and the like, so I really enjoyed that version with him of Northanger Abbey. And finally, also worth a mention is a film called Love and Friendship, which came out in 2016 and starred Kate Beckinsale. And that is actually based on Lady Susan, which is one of the short works in this little collection here. But it was called Love and Friendship as the film version. And that's, it's a bit different. It doesn't take itself too seriously. There's a real play on the comedy aspect of the story in that one. But it's definitely worth a look. However, I would probably stick with some of the main 6 novels first and then move on to that one later. So those are a few thoughts on Jane Austen and her works. If you've got any comments, do you have a favourite Jane Austen? Is there an adaptation that you particularly love you want to share? Pop it in the comments below. I look forward to reading them. I'll be back next month with another crash course in the classics. If there's an author you'd particularly like me to do drop that in the comments too. I have a bit of a list that I'm working through, but if there's someone that anyone particularly requests, I'll do my best to bump them up the list a bit for you. I will end there for now, but I look forward to talking to you all again very soon. Take care everyone. Bye bye.